Hello and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Wajenberg. This time we will continue our reading of Christmas at Fairacre by Miss Reed. An hour later, Margaret and Mary sat at their own table serving three excited little girls with Christmas dinner. Nurse's car still stood outside the cottage opposite, but Dr. Martin's was not to be seen. Evidently all was going well, and Nurse had everything well in hand. Mary found herself as excited as the children. What a relief it was to be at home again and to know that Mrs. Emery was being properly nursed. It was impossible to eat amid such momentous happenings, and she was glad to neglect her own plate and to have the pleasant task of guiding Anna Louise's teaspoon in the right direction. St. Patrick's clock chimed 3, and still no message came from the house across the road. A few Fairacre folk began to go by, taking an afternoon stroll for the sake of their digestions between Christmas dinner and the further challenge of iced cake for tea. They noted Nurse's car and the light in the upstairs window and fell to wondering. Margaret was reading The Tale of Two Bad Mice from a new glossy copy which the children had received that morning, when a tapping came at the door. Mrs. Lamb from the post office stood outside with a posy of anemones in her hand. She caught sight of the little girls inside and spoke in a whisper. "For their mother, my dear. Hope all's going well. We heard about it after church. You're going over again, I expect?" "Yes, indeed," answered Margaret, accepting the bright bunch. "She'll be pleased with these. Nurse is still there, as you see." She nodded toward the car. "Give Mrs. Emery our best wishes," said Mrs. Lamb. "Poor soul, without her husband, too. She's got everyone's sympathy, that's a fact." She set off homeward, and Margaret returned to the fireside. It began to grow dark, for the afternoon was overcast, and Mary took a taper and lit the bright red candles. The flames stretched and dwindled in the draught, and the little girls gazed at them starry-eyed. "Do you always have candles?" asked Vanessa, "or just at Christmas?" "Just at Christmas," said Margaret. She put down the book and gazed at the bright flames with the children. The waiting seemed endless, and suddenly she felt desperately tired. How much longer, she wondered, before they knew? Just then they heard the sound of a gate shutting and footsteps coming to the door. The two eldest sisters exchanged swift glances. Could it be? Mary opened the door, and there stood the nurse, smiling. "Come in," said Mary. "I daren't. I'm late now," said Nurse, "but all's well." Margaret and the children gathered at the door. "A boy," Nurse announced proudly. £7 and bonny, and Mrs. Emery's asleep. Can one of you go over?" "You go," said Margaret to Mary. "I'll bring the children over later." "We want to see him," pleaded Vanessa. "Now," added Francesca stubbornly. "Now," echoed Anna Louise, not understanding the situation, but glad to try a new word. "Later on," responded Nurse firmly. "Your mummy's tired." She turned to go and then looked back. "Mr. Emery rang up. I've told him the news, and he'll be back very soon." She waved and made her way across the road to the car. "Tell Mr. Emery I'll be in the morning," she called, and drove off in a cloud of smoke. As if by magic, two heads popped out from the doorway of the Beetle and Wedge. They belonged to the landlord and his wife. "Couldn't help seeing Nurse go off," he said to Mary. "What is it?" "A boy," said Mary, smiling. "Now ain't that good news?" beamed his wife. "You tell her we'll be wetting the baby's head in here tonight." "Ah, she's a grand little mother for all her funny ways," declared her husband. "Tell her it'll be nice to have another young'un in the village." Mary tiptoed into the silent cottage. Everything seemed to slumber. The cat slept on a chair by the stove. Nothing moved. She left the door of the staircase ajar so that she could hear the slightest sound from above, and sat down at the table. In the domestic stillness which enveloped her, after the stress of the day, old and lovely words came into her mind. "And it came to pass, while they were there, the days were fulfilled that she should be delivered. And she brought forth her firstborn son, and she wrapped him in swaddling clothes, and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn." Mary sat motionless, savoring the age-old miracle of the Nativity. And here, in this house, was another Christmas baby. She felt that she could not wait another moment. She must see him. She slipped off her stout country shoes and tiptoed up the stairs. It was very quiet in the bedroom. Mrs. Emery, looking pathetically young and pale, slept deeply. Beside the bed, on 2 chairs, was a carry-cot. Mary leant over and gazed in wonder. Swaddled tightly in the shawl she had found for him in the airing cupboard was the newborn baby, as oblivious of the world about him as his sleeping mother. Mary's heart beat with such fervor that she wondered the sleepers did not wake. Full of joy, she crept below once more, and in her dizzy head beat the words, "And the angel said unto them, Be not afraid, for behold, I bring you tidings of great joy, which shall be to all people." There was a sound outside, and she looked up from her lacing her shoes. There stood Mr. Emery, his face alight. "Where is she?" he asked. "They're both upstairs," whispered Mary, and opened the staircase door so that he could go aloft and see his son. Late that night, the 2 sisters sat each side of the hearth working at their rug. "Do you know what Vanessa said when her father fetched her?" asked Margaret. "She said, 'This is the loveliest Christmas we've ever had.' 'Twas good of the child to say it, I thought, after such a muddling old day. It touched me very much." "She spoke the truth," replied Mary slowly, "not only for herself, but for all of us here in Fairacre. 'Tis a funny thing, sister, but when I crept up the stairs to take a first look at that new babe, the thought came to me, 'Ah, you're a true Fairacre child, just as I was once, born here, and most likely to be bred up here, the Lord willing.' And then another thought came, 'You've warmed up us cold old Fairacre folk quicker 'n the sun melts frost.' You know, Margaret, them Emerys have put us all to shame many a time with their friendly ways, and been snubbed too, often as not. To look at a Christmas baby is to kindle some proper Christmas goodwill in Fairacre." "'Tis true," admitted Margaret, putting down the rug hook and gazing into the dying fire. Into her tired mind there floated irrelevant memories. Mrs. Emery's scarlet petticoat, a ginger cat lapping milk, Anna Louise fumbling with her egg spoon while her sisters watched her with squirrel-bright eyes, laughing at her antics. All added up to color and warmth and gentle loving kindness. "Now this has happened," she said soberly. "It won't stop at Christmas goodwill, sister. The Emerys are part and parcel of this village for good. There's room for all sorts in Fairacre, Mary, but it took a newborn babe to show us." She began to roll up the rug briskly. "Come, sister, time we was abed." The Christmas Mouse. Chapter 1. The rain began at noon. At first it fell lightly, making little noise. Only the darkening of the thatched roofs and the sheen on the damp flagstones made people aware of the rain. It was dismissed as only a mizzle. Certainly it did not warrant bringing in the tea towels from the line. Midday meals were taken in the confident belief that the shower would soon blow over. Why, the weathermen had predicted a calm spell, hadn't they, only that morning? But by 2 o'clock it was apparent that something was radically wrong with the weather forecast. The wind had swung round to the northwest, and the drizzle had turned to a downpour. It hissed among the dripping trees, pattered upon the cabbages in cottage gardens, and drummed the bare soil with pockmarks. Mrs. Barry, at her kitchen window, watched the clouds of rain drifting across the fields, obscuring the distant wood and veiling the whole countryside. A vicious gust of wind flung a spatter of raindrops against the pane with so much force that it might have been a handful of gravel hurled in the old lady's face. She did not flinch, but instead raised her voice against the mounting fury of the storm. "What a day," said Mrs. Barry, "for Christmas Eve!" Behind her, kneeling on the rush matting, her daughter Mary was busy buttoning her 2 little girls into their mackintoshes. "Hold still," she said impatiently. "Hold still, do. We'll never catch the bus at this rate." They were fidgeting with excitement. Their cheeks were flushed, their eyes sparkling. It was as much as they could do to lift their chins for their mother to fasten the stiff top buttons of their new red mackintoshes. But the reminder that the bus might go without them checked their excitement. Only 2 afternoon buses a week ran past the cottage, one on market day and one on Saturday. To miss it meant missing the last-minute shopping expedition for the really important Christmas presents, those for their mother and grandmother. The idea of being deprived of this joy brought the little girls to partial submission. Mary, her fingers busy with the buttons, was thinking of more mundane shopping. Brussels sprouts, some salad, a little pot of cranberry jelly for the turkey, a few more oranges if they were not too expensive, a lemon or two, and a potted plant for Mum. A cyclamen, perhaps? Or a heather, if the cyclamen proved to be beyond her purse. It was mean the way these florists put up the prices so cruelly at Christmas. But there, she told herself, scrambling to her feet, the poor souls had to live the same as she did, she supposed, and with everything costing so much, they would have to look after themselves like anyone else. "You wait here quietly with Gran for a minute," she adjured the pair, "while I run and get my coat on and fetch the baskets. Got your money in your hankies? Don't want no sniffing on the bus now." She whisked upstairs, and the children could hear her hurrying to and fro above the beamed ceiling of the kitchen. Old Mrs. Barry was opening her brown leather purse. There were not many coins in it, and no notes, but she took out 2 silver 5-penny pieces. "To go towards your shopping," said the old lady. "Hold out your hands." 2 small hands, encased in woolen gloves knitted by Mrs. Barry herself, were eagerly outstretched. "Jane first," said Mrs. Barry, putting the coin into the older girl's hand. "And now Frances." "Thank you, Gran, thank you," they chorused, throwing their arms around her comfortable bulk, pressing wet kisses upon her. "No need to tell your Mum," said Mrs. Barry. "It's a little secret between us 3. Here she comes." The 3 hurried to the cottage door. The rain was coming down in sheets, and Mary struggled with an umbrella on the threshold. "Dratted thing," she puffed, "but can't do without it today. I'll wager I forget it in some shop, but there it is. Come on now, you girls, keep close to me and run for it." Mrs. Barry watched them vanish into the swirling rain. Then she shut the door upon the weather and returned to the peaceful kitchen. She put her wrinkled hand upon the teapot. Good, it was still hot. She would have another cup before she washed up. Sitting in the wooden armchair that had been her husband's, Mrs. Barry surveyed the kitchen with pleasure. It had been decorated a few years before, and young Bertie, Mary's husband, had made a good job of it. The walls were white, the curtains cherry red cotton, and the tiles round the sink were blue and white. Bertie, who had set them so neatly, said they came from a fireplace over in Oxfordshire and were from Holland originally. The builder, a friend of his, was about to throw them out, but Bertie had rescued them. A clever boy with his hands, thought Mrs. Barry, sipping her tea, though she could never understand what poor Mary saw in him, with that sandy hair and those white eyelashes. Still, it did no good to think ill of the dead, and he had made a good husband and father for the few short years he and Mary had been married. This would be the 3rd Christmas without him. A sad time for Mary, poor soul. Mrs. Barry had once wondered if this youngest daughter of hers would ever marry. The 2 older girls were barely 20 when they wed. One was a farmer's wife near Taunton. The other had married an American, and Mrs. Barry had only seen her twice since. Mary, the prettiest of the 3 girls, had never been one for the boys. After she left school, she worked in the village post office at Springbourne, cycling to work in all weather and seeming content to read and knit or tend the garden when she returned at night. Mrs. Barry was glad of her daughter's company. She had been widowed in 1953, after over 30 years of tranquil marriage to dear Stanley. He had been a stonemason attached to an old established firm in Caxley, and he too cycled daily to work, his tools strapped securely on the carrier with his midday sandwiches. On a day as wild and wet as this Christmas Eve, he had arrived home soaked through. That night he tossed in a fever, muttering in delirium, and within a week he was dead, the victim of a particularly virulent form of influenza. In the weeks of shock and mourning that followed, Mary was a tower of strength to her mother. Once the funeral was over and replies had been sent to all the friends and relatives who had written in sympathy, the 2 women took stock of their situation. Thank God the cottage was her own, Mrs. Barry said. It had taken the savings of a lifetime to buy it when it came on the market, but now they had a roof over their head and no weekly rent to find. There was a tiny pension from Stanley's firm, a few pounds to the post office savings bank, and Mary's weekly wage. 2 mornings of housework every week at the manor farm brought in a few more shillings for Mrs. Barry, and the farmer's wife, knowing her circumstances, offered her more work, which she gladly accepted. It was a happy household, and Mrs. Barry was as grateful for the cheerful company she found there as for the extra money. Mother and daughter fell into a comfortable routine during the next few years. They breakfasted together before the younger woman set off on her bicycle, and Mrs. Barry tidied up before going off to her morning's work at the farmhouse. In the afternoon, she did her own housework, washed and ironed, gardened or knitted and sewed. She frugally made jams and jellies, chutneys and pickles for the store and cupboard, and it was generally acknowledged by her neighbors that Mrs. Barry could stretch a shilling twice as far as most. The house was bright and attractive, and the door stood open for visitors. No one left Mrs. Barry without feeling all the better for her company. Her good sense, her kindness, and her courage brought many people to her door. Mary had been almost 30 when she met Bertie Fuller. He was the nephew of the old lady who kept the Springbourne post office and had come to lodge with her when he took a job at the Caxley printing works. Even those romantically inclined had to admit that nothing as fantastic as love at first sight engulfed Mary and Bertie. She had never been one to show her feelings, and now, at her age, was unlikely to be swept off her feet. Bertie was 5 years her senior and had been married before. There were no children of this first marriage, and his wife had married again. The two were attracted to each other and were engaged within 3 months of their first meeting. "Well, my dear, you're old enough to know your own mind," said Mrs. Barry, "and he seems a decent, kindly sort of man with a steady job. If you'd like to have 2 rooms here while you look for a house, you're both welcome." No, the villagers agreed as they gossiped among themselves. Mary Barry hadn't exactly caught a regular heartthrob, but what could you expect at 30? She was lucky really to have found anyone, and they did say this Bertie fellow was safe at the printing works, and no doubt was of an age to have sown all the wild oats he wanted. The wedding was as modest as befitted the circumstances, and the pair were married at Caxley Registry Office, spent their brief honeymoon at Torquay, and returned to share the cottage with old Mrs. Barry. It was October 1963, and the autumn was one of the most golden and serene that anyone could recall. Their first child was due to arrive the following September. Mary gave up her job at the post office in June. The summer was full of promise. The cottage garden flowered as never before, and Mary, resting in a deck chair, gazed dreamily at the Madonna lilies and golden roses and dwelt on the happy lot of the future baby. They had all set their hearts on a boy, and Mary was convinced that it would be a son. Blue predominated in the layette that she and Mrs. Barry so lovingly prepared. When her time came, she was taken to the maternity wing of the local hospital and gave birth to a boy, fair and blue-eyed like his father. She held him in her arms for a moment before returning him to the nurse's care. In her joy, she did not notice the anxious looks the doctor and nurse exchanged, nor did she realize that her child had been taken from her bed straight to an oxygen tent. In the morning, they broke the news to her that the boy had died. Mary never forgot the utter desolation that gripped her for weeks after this terrible loss. Her husband and mother nursed her together back to health, but always, throughout her whole life, Mary remembered that longed-for boy with the blue gaze and mourned in secret. A daughter, Jane, was born in the spring of 1966, and another, Frances, in 1968. The 2 little girls were a lively pair, and when the younger one was beginning to toddle, Bertie and Mary set about finding a cottage of their own. Until that time, Mrs. Barry had been glad to have them with her. Mary's illness, then her second pregnancy, made her husband and mother particularly anxious. Now it seemed the time had come for the young family to look for their own home. Mrs. Barry's cottage was becoming overcrowded. The search was difficult. They wanted to rent a house to begin with, but this proved to be almost impossible. The search was still on when the annual printing house outing, called the Ways Goose, took place. 2 buses set off for Weymouth, carrying the workers and their wives. Mary decided not to go on the day's outing. Frances had a summer cold and was restless, and her mother had promised to go to a Women's Institute meeting in the afternoon. So Bertie went alone. It was a cloudless July day, warm from the sun's rising until its setting. Mary, pushing the pram along a leafy lane, thought enviously of Bertie and his companions sitting on a beach or swimming in the freshness of the sea. She knew Weymouth from earlier outings and loved its great curved bay. Today it would be looking its finest. The evening dragged after the children had gone to bed. Usually the adults retired at 10, for all rose early. On this evening, however, Mrs. Barry went upstairs alone, leaving Mary to await Bertie's coming. 11 o'clock struck, then 12. Yawning, bemused with the long day's heat, Mary began to lock up. She was about to lock the front door when she heard a car draw up. Someone rapped upon the door, and when Mary opened it, to her surprise, she saw Mr. Partridge, the vicar, standing there. His kind old face was drawn with anxiety. "I'm so sorry to be so late, my dear Mrs. Fuller, but a telephone message has just come to the vicarage." "Yes?" questioned Mary. The vicar looked about him in agitation. "Do you think we might sit down for a moment?" Mary remembered her manners. "Of course, I'm so sorry. Come in." She led the way into the sitting room, still bewildered. "It's about Bertie," began the vicar. "There's been an accident, I fear, somewhere south of Caxley. When things were sorted out, someone asked me to let you know that Bertie wouldn't be home tonight." "What's happened? Is he badly hurt? Is he dead? Where is he?" Mary sprang to her feet, her eyes wild. The vicar spoke soothingly. "He's in Caxley Hospital and being cared for. I know no more, my dear, but I thought you would like to go there straight away and see him." Without a word, Mary lifted an old coat from the back of the kitchen door. The vicar eyed her anxiously. "Would it not be best to tell Mrs. Barry?" he suggested. She shook her head. "I'll leave a note." He waited while she scribbled briefly upon a piece of paper and watched her put it in the middle of the kitchen table. "No point in waking her," she said, closing the front door softly behind her. The two set off in silence, too worried to make conversation. The air was heavy with the scent of honeysuckle. Moths glimmered in the beams of the headlights and fell to their deaths. How easily, Mary thought, fear clutching her heart, death comes to living things. The memory of her little son filled her mind as they drove through the night to meet what might be another tragedy. At the hospital, they were taken to a small waiting room. Within a minute, a doctor came to them. There was no need for him to speak. His face told Mary all. Bertie had gone. The Waysgoose, begun so gaily, had ended in tragedy. The 2 buses had drawn up a few miles from Caxley to allow the passengers to have a last drink before closing time. They had to cross a busy road to enter the old coaching inn, famed for its hospitality. Returning to the bus, Bertie and a friend waited some time for a lull in the traffic. It was a busy road leading to the coast, and despite the late hour, the traffic was heavy. At last, they made a dash for it, not realizing that a second car was overtaking the one they could see. The latter slowed down to let the 2 men cross, but the second car could not stop in time. Both men were hurled to the ground, Bertie being dragged some yards before the car stopped. Despite appalling injuries, he was alive when admitted to the hospital, but died within the hour. The organizer of the outing, knowing that Mary was not on the telephone, decided to let the local vicar break the news of the accident. Mr. Partridge and poor Mary returned along the dark lanes to the darker cottage, where he aroused Mrs. Barry, told her the terrible story, and left her trying to comfort the young widow. If anyone can succeed, Mr. Partridge thought as he drove sadly to his vicarage, she can. But oh, the waste of it all, the wicked waste. And now that we have set the stage, we will continue the story of the Christmas mouse next time.